We're going to talk about poetic form today, the key terms and vocabulary that you'll need on the playlist. So you should have pen and paper so that you can take notes, and as you take notes, you'll be working to understand the definitions of each of the terms and identify examples of each of the terms on this presentation. We're going to be specifically talking about form, closed form, including blank verse, sonnets, both Petrarchan and Shakespearean, and villanelles. We'll also talk about open form or free verse. Overall, the form of a poem just refers to the way that it's designed, structured, or configured. Often, these poems have easily recognized forms, and by being able to identify the form of a poem, you'll be able to understand its overall meaning. Poets frequently make these choices intentionally, and they use the form of their poem to create a specific effect. Poems write in either closed form or open form, and you'll learn more about each of these forms of poetry as we continue with the following slides. A poem that's written in closed form has a recognizable pattern of rhyme, meter, and number of lines. Most of the poetry written before the 20th century is written in closed form. And this is because as we go back to ancient Greece, when bards or people who would sing poetry, they were better able to remember epic poems, just the really long oral histories, because the devices such as rhyme, meter, and number of lines were consistent. Some important examples of closed form poetry include blank verse, sonnets, and villanelles. Open form poetry, on the other hand, does not follow any of these recognizable patterns. Open form poetry relies heavily on figurative language, enjambment, and the way a poem might appear on the page. Open form poetry can also be known as free verse. Free verse poetry mostly emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Most of the poems that we read today are written in free verse, or there's some combination of kind of a looser, closed form poetry. To compare the way a closed form poem and an open form poem look, you can see the two examples below. The first is a sonnet. Sonnets always have 14 lines. There's recognizable rhyme and meter. An example of that would be the sonnet written by William Shakespeare. That's read, "Let me not to the marriage of two minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks, when within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours or weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ nor not man ever loved." So clearly we're talking about the idea of love in this poem. The example of free verse poetry also discusses the idea of love, but does so with no rhyme, no meter, and no other recognizable patterns. It's called The Heart by Stephen Crane. "In the desert I saw a creature, naked, bestial, who, squatting upon the ground, held his heart in his hands and ate of it. I said, 'Is it good, friend?' 'It is bitter, bitter,' he answered. 'But I like it because it is bitter and because it is my heart.'" So clearly both of these have two very different perspectives on love, and the structure of the poem kind of reflects the poet's different perceptions of the same idea of love. One of the types of closed form poems that you'll see often is called blank verse. Blank verse is any poem whose lines are written in an unrhymed iambic pentameter. So even they follow a consistent structured meter, they don't show any rhyme. Some poets who often wrote in blank verse include John Milton and Robert Frost. Shakespeare wrote most of his plays in blank verse as well. So most of his plays will follow the iambic pentameter meter, but they won't rhyme at the end of the line. Iambic pentameter closely resembles English speech or the human heartbeat because it follows the unstressed, stressed pattern kind of like the heartbeat, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. It might be considered elevated because it has this regular meter, but blank verse has a more natural tone than other closed forms like the sonnet or villanelle. And that's because there are very structured and rigid rules around rhyming in a sonnet and in a villanelle. You can find out more about iambic pentameter and other kinds of meter in the Poetic Sound playlist as well. One example of blank verse is written by John Keats in 1819. It reads, "This living hand now warm and capable of earnest grasping would, if it were cold, and in the icy silence of the tomb so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming night, that thou wouldst wish thine own heart dry of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again, and thou be conscience calmed, see here it is, I hold it towards you." So this poem was written by John Keats to his fiancée. He wrote it as he was dying from tuberculosis. You'll notice in this last line that it's not written in iambic pentameter. And this isn't just because John Keats got lazy and was tired of putting together this meter. It's because this signifies a shift in tone or a shift in meaning. And that shift kind of helps us understand why he wrote this poem. Even though his life is ending, we're emphasizing and he's calling our attention toward how he holds his heart towards his fiancée, how he will always love her even in death. Because we're kind of struck by that shift in meter, that the aberration from the structure from the iambic pentameter before, our attention is really called to this last line of the poem. Another type of closed form poetry is the sonnet. Sonnets were originally an Italian verse form, though there are now two main types of sonnets, the Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean or English sonnet. Both sonnets are composed of 14 lines, and both have a pretty strict rhyme scheme. They are contained, structured, and concise within those 14 lines. Sonnets also always contain a shift, and when we're talking about sonnets, it's specifically called a volta. The Petrarchan sonnet was developed by the writer Francesco Petrarca in the 1320s to the 1370s. He is one of the most prolific and most well-known Italian sonneteers. He wrote hundreds of sonnets, and all of these, for the most part, were written to his idealized lover, whom we know as Laura. The Shakespearean sonnet arose as the sonnet form made its way to England, and England is where Shakespeare wrote most of his famous sonnets. There are some significant changes, especially in the rhyme scheme from a Petrarchan to a Shakespearean sonnet, and a big part of that is because Italian is a pretty easy language to rhyme in, whereas English is not so easy. Both of these sonnets are usually written in iambic pentameter, again, focusing on the iamb, the metric foot of two syllables that follows the unstressed, stressed pattern. Pentameter referring to the 5 of those iambs in each line of poetry. For a Petrarchan sonnet, the structure of it is almost always going to be the same. You're going to have 2 stanzas of 4 lines each that follow the A-B-B-A rhyme scheme. Each of those 4-line stanzas is called a quatrain. Together, those quatrains form the octave. Secondly, you have 6 lines that all show up together in one stanza that follow a C-D-E rhyme scheme. This last stanza of 6 lines is known as the sestet. The reason the sonnet is split up into these 2 sections, the octave and the sestet, is that in the first lines, the opening 8 lines, we're presented with an opening statement or some kind of question, an argument, or a perspective of the author. The final 6 lines, the sestet, answers or proposes a resolution to that statement, question, argument, and perspective. The switch between the octave and the sestet is called the volta. It's that shift in tone from asking the question to answering the question or resolving the problem. So again, that volta will be found in Petrarchan sonnet between lines 8 and lines 9. An example of a Petrarchan sonnet is written by Edna St. Vincent Millay. It's slightly revised for the rhyme scheme, but for the most part follows the structure. As I read, you should take note of the rhyme scheme as well as the meter of the poem. What my lips have kissed and where and why I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. Thus in winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone, I only know that summer sang in me a little while that in me sings no more. So the first thing that we'll notice is that there are 10 syllables in each line of poetry. These 10 syllables follow the iambic pentameter structure of unstressed, stressed syllables. Secondly, you'll notice the rhyme scheme. Why, sigh, reply, cry, all rhyme to form our A rhyme scheme, followed by bees, lane, rain, pain, again, slightly slant rhyme there, but was probably pronounced differently at the time it was written. This line between 8 and 9 indicates the volta. So this is where we're turning from the author talking about all the loves that she's known and kind of thinking and reminiscing about those loves, to here where she's resolving that. She's coming to grips with the fact that she might be alone, that she's not experiencing the love in the same way. We know that that shift happens not just from the content, but also from the structure of the poem. Contrastingly, in a Shakespearean sonnet, there are 3 quatrains and a final couplet. This is often called the heroic couplet at the end. These quatrains, again, are stanzas made up of 4 lines. They also follow a highly structured rhyme scheme, even though it's a little bit different. The rhyme scheme in a Shakespearean sonnet is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and the final couplet rhymes right next to each other with a G, G, totally different rhyming section. These 3 opening quatrains show images or arguments, and we consider these links helpful in reading. They kind of all come together to give us the entire perspective or the whole picture on the topic of the poem. And then the couplet at the end is the most powerful part of the sonnet. Just like we look to that sestet for the resolution, we look to the couplet to find the meaning of the poem. This is known as the loudest, most powerful part of the sonnet. We see that this is where meaning is revealed, and all of the kind of connections between the images presented in the 3 previous quatrains come together to form meaning. An example of a Shakespearean sonnet, this is a pretty famous one, it's Sonnet 18. And again, as I read, notice the rhyme scheme, the differences between the quatrains, and try and figure out the meaning that's presented in the final couplet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dim. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So again, the first thing that we notice are those 10 syllables in each line of the poem. Again, we see the iambic pentameter, and we also notice the rhyme scheme. To emphasize the iambic pentameter, I'm just going to call it out in this first line by really emphasizing the unstressed, stressed pattern. When we read it, it will sound pretty normal, but when we break down what that meter is, it might sound like this. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Again, not the natural way to read it, but to show that emphasis that this does, in fact, follow the iambic meter. Another type of closed form poem is known as a villanelle. A villanelle, just like a sonnet, always follows the same structure. It's 19 lines. Each of those 19 lines are broken down into 5 stanzas, each with 3 lines, and a 6th stanza that's composed of 4 lines. The first line of the first stanza is repeated as the final line in the second and fourth stanzas. The third line, so the last line of the first stanza, is repeated as the last line of stanzas 3 and 5. The final 2 lines of the poem are the first line of the first stanza and the third line of the first stanza, back to back. The rhyme scheme follows ABA throughout the entire thing, and the rhymes are repeated according to which line shows up, either the first line of the first stanza or the third line of the first stanza. The villanelle is a pretty old form of poetry. It was first established about 500 years ago in Italy, but some of the best 20th century poets have turned to the villanelle. You might wonder why we started using such an old structure of poetry again. And a lot of it is that this form doesn't really tell a story. You see this really extreme repetition of lines and this highly structured rhyme scheme. And this form circles, kind of going around and around, but doesn't move forward. So you really see an emphasis of whatever it is that the poet wants to discuss. You get that idea kind of put in your face over and over and over again. This type of poetry is much more similar to a song, some kind of lyric poetry. And while a lot of this poetry is focused on loss, the form of the villanelle addresses the idea of loss directly. So the circular structure really brings us back to the idea of loss. And that's a pretty standard concept that the villanelle deals with. So an example of that is written by Dylan Thomas. As I read, take note of the structure. There's this little reminder here if you're wondering what structure should you be looking for. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end know dark is right. Because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Brave men near death who see the blinding sight, blind eyes can blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So even though you're singing this pretty highly structured poem, one thing that you'll notice is that there's not a specific meter. This does not necessarily follow the iambic pentameter or another structured meter, which is probably good because there's so many other structures that have to be followed, like 19 lines, 5 stanzas, and then the last stanza, 4 lines. To just kind of clarify a little bit about this repetition of lines, you can see them highlighted. The first line of stanza 1, do not go gentle into that good night, is repeated at the end of the second stanza, the end of the fourth stanza, and in the penultimate or second to last line of the final stanza. Likewise, line 3 of stanza 1, rage, rage against the dying of the light, is repeated at the end of the third stanza, the end of the fifth stanza, and is the final line of the final stanza of the poem. You also notice the rhyme scheme here. Night, light, right, bright, light, sight, and height. Likewise, the B part of the rhyme scheme would be seen in day, they, way, gay, and gray. So you'll see each of those things reflected. It's very much, you know what to expect in each of the stanzas. Moving on to open form. Open form poems do not follow this traditional pattern of rhyme, meter, or length. They can be any number of lines, follow any meter or no meter at all, and they may or may not have a rhyme scheme. Poems written in open form emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, known as free verse, implying that poets were freeing themselves from the confines of rhyme scheme, meter, and length. This gave a lot of people more opportunity to express what they really thought without having to worry about, does this fit any traditional structure? When a poet writes free verse, he or she relies heavily on the use of figurative language, line length, and white space in order to create an experience for the reader. You might notice this in some poems written by Eaton Cummings. Some of them are almost written to reflect the topic of the poem itself, like actually look like a drawing of the words, and to show what the poem is getting at. An example of free verse can be seen in The Ancient Stairway, written by Denise Levertov in 1999. As I read, notice these kind of concepts, the line breaks, when and how there's enjambment, and notice how that kind of keeps you on your toes. It keeps you a little bit off guard for what's going to happen next, unlike in a sonnet where you very much know what to expect. The words ascending, descending, century by century have a really heavy rhythm, like you have to really work to get through them. And finally, you'll notice that the arrangement of the lines almost looks like stairs. So the way that this is structured, you can almost see a staircase developed in the way that this poem is put together. Footsteps like water hollow the broad curves of stone, ascending, descending, century by century. Who can say if the last to climb these stairs will be journeying downward or upward? So you'll notice a few things. Again, the way that this poem is structured does not follow any specific traditional structures, even though there are some very clear structural elements in it, like the use of ascending and descending, that repetitive or that rhyme to really slow things down, the use of enjambment to make it seem like you're just continuously going from line to line without being able to stop. So hopefully by now you have notes on the following terms, including closed form, blank verse, sonnets, Petrarchan, Shakespearean, Villanelle, open form, and free verse, and have a much better understanding of what each of these structures or forms mean and how to identify them in a poem and use them to help your understanding. If you have any questions, definitely go back and re-watch a specific section of this presentation. You can also find this presentation without my narrative listed as a resource on the Poetic.